Speaker, I rise to speak in the third reading of the Misuse of Drugs Amendment Bill and say, as my colleague Damien O'Connor did, that Labor does support this bill, but we do have a number of concerns about it. So the bill itself will amend the Misuse of Drugs Act 1975 to reclassify ephedrine and pseudoephedrine as Class B2 controlled drugs, remove thalidomide as a Class A controlled drug, allow hazardous substances to be scheduled as restricted substances, and I'm going to come back to that, and extend control over drug paraphernalia. So while we support the bill, we do remain concerned that the bill as written would not achieve the aim of reducing the availability of methamphetamine, P, or reducing drug-related harm. And certainly the government has taken a long time to get to this point of implementing this legislation, given John Key announced in October 2009, I believe, an action plan on P with 5 prongs, and I understand this to be prong number 1. Here we are nearly in the election, and we've got prong number 1. But anyway, the other issue is, of course, dealing with this ban on synthetic cannabis. Now, this is again another one where the government has dithered on this issue. Peter Dunn has talked tough on cleaning up synthetic cannabis industry, and it's largely been hot air. He dithered on this ban despite recommendations from the Law Commission and calls from the public and from sector groups for action. And just looking, and we raised the issue with him 6 months ago and even provided at the time Mr Dunn with examples of this legal high, this synthetic cannabis. Now, he's made a number of comments since that time. In March the 30th, he said, "I've instructed the Ministry of Health to begin the process of putting the necessary controls in place. I expect these changes to come into effect next year." On June the 3rd, on why he hadn't banned synthetic cannabis, he said the evidence wasn't strong enough to go that far, and I don't want to go down that path and then be challenged in court and overturned, because you end up looking a bit silly at that point. Well, here we are, probably looking a bit silly in August really. But on June the 17th, on why the Law Commission recommendation to make suppliers prove the safety of synthetic cannabis could not be introduced until after the election, quote, "We're under certain statutory requirements and we have complications of a general election occurring." August the 1st, so more recently, quote, "Frankly, I felt we couldn't wait. I wanted to make sure we had a mechanism that simply removes these items from the shelves completely." So in the course of those few months, you've seen all sorts of variations on the theme from the Minister. So, of course, we now have in Part 1 the new clauses 3A and 3B, temporary class drug notice, and this amendment will place a 12-month ban on the sale of all synthetic cannabis products and other new drugs to allow enough time for the Minister to obtain the necessary advice on the drug's appropriate classification. Now, we're supporting that. And what it provides will be that the Minister will put a notice published in the Gazette specifying as a temporary class drug a substance, preparation, mixture or article that is not a Class A, Class B or Class C controlled drug, a restrictive substance or a precursor substance, but that the Minister is satisfied poses or may pose a risk of harm to individuals or to society. So what that will mean is that the temporary class drug will be treated, for the most of the purposes of that Act, as a Class C1 controlled drug, except as specified. The temporary class drug is not added to any of the schedules of the Misuse of Drugs Act 1975 while the notice is in force. Now, while that temporary class drug notice is in force, the Minister must seek advice as to its appropriate classification, and that will provide that 12-month period will provide that opportunity. Now, as I said, Labor welcomes the decision to place that 12-month ban on synthetic cannabis products and other new drugs, because as Mr O'Connor has said, there is undoubtedly going to be others that will come through, until there is more sustainable regulation of new substances. But we are concerned that the government has taken too long to do this. And despite all the public protestations by the Associate Health Minister that the government takes this issue particularly seriously, it has dithered on it since last year. For example, the Misuse of Drugs Amendment Bill has been buried in the order paper since November last year. In addition, the government has done little in response to the Law Commission's report, which was tabled in May of this year. So the government's so-called stronger additional amendments to current drug legislation will simply continue the decades-old ad hoc approach to drug abuse and control in New Zealand. We have been pushing for the government to implement these stopgap measures so that no more harm is caused to individuals until the Ministry of Health has had time to research the effect of the drugs. So I just want to talk about the response to harm, because it does worry me, and Mr O'Connor alluded to the issue of alcohol harm. I'm on the Select Committee, the Justice and Electoral Select Committee, that is dealing with the alcohol bill. Now, this is an issue that is one where we've got the research base, there's no doubt about that, fantastic work done by the Law Commission on alcohol and the issue of harm, and I just want to compare it, Mr Speaker, with the response here to the synthetic cannabis issue and also the P issue, because really if we're looking at priorities, you have to say that the alcohol issue is the priority in terms of drug harm, and certainly in comparison to all other forms of drugs, including P and synthetic cannabis and whatever else you like, alcohol is really significant because of the scale of the problem, but also because, unlike every other drug, research we've seen in the Select Committee compares all of these other drugs with alcohol, and the difference is really interesting, and the difference is this, that for most drugs, the harm is to the individual using P, although certainly I'll come back to P, but the individual using synthetic cannabis, the harm is predominantly to the individual. In the case of alcohol, more harm is actually done to other people. So when you look at the harm from alcohol, yes, there is harm to the individual, no question. And Mr O'Connor went through some of those issues around addiction there, around cirrhosis, around other health issues, cancers, mental health issues, you name it. But the harm to others is what is really significant with the issue of alcohol. The harm to the people who are subject to violence by those who are drunk. The harm to people driving cars. So, and there are some similarities, I would admit, with P, which is subject of this bill. But I am very concerned that this bill we've certainly taken too long dithering around on this, but we are taking far too long in dithering around on the alcohol issue. And as it stands, sadly, it looks like there will not be new legislation in place before the election. What we will have is a watered-down response to the Law Commission's report on alcohol and have a first reading on that. So I did want to make that comparison. Now, getting back to specifically the Misuse of Drugs Amendment Bill, sir, as you are suggesting I do, I would just also like to talk about the issue of importation and supply of drug utensils, which is Clause 4 of this bill. Now, that broadens the definition of Section 22 by prohibiting the sale, importation and supply of drug utensils, including pipes, other utensils and identifiable components of a pipe or other utensil. What that broadening of scope will do will mean the police will be more effectively able to deter the sale of drug utensils by removing the limitation that an offence occurs once the sale has been made. So in other words, you buy it and then you do something with it that's an offence. Police also understand that this amendment will remove the difficulties that the Customs Service has with restricting the importation of incomplete drug utensils and identifiable parts. Making it as an offence to sell, supply and import utensils would assist. So this is the purpose of it. Now, the thing that we're aware of is that the committee received no evidence, I repeat, no evidence whatsoever, that the changes in this clause would bring about a reduction in drug use, which you would think would be the important factor here. So 59 of the 65 submitters opposed the proposed amendment to the utensils provision, and many submitters stated that the utensils provisions may prove a minor inconvenience to those importing and selling them, but they are likely to respond with small changes of behaviour to evade the law. So I just leave that there seeming like a relatively less useful part of this bill, sir.
Members, this debate is concluded. The question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Party votes called for. I'll ask the clerk for a party vote.
New Zealand National.
57 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
42 votes in favour.
Green Party.
9 votes opposed.
ACT New Zealand.
5 votes opposed.
No.
Māori Party.
Toko toru e tautoko ana.
Progressive.
1 in favour.
United Future.
1 vote.
Mana. Honourable Chris Carter.
1 vote opposed.
Any other votes?
Members, the ayes are 104, the noes are 15. The motion is agreed to.
Misuse of Drugs Amendment Bill, third reading.
Call on Government Order of the Day number 2.